The Trump administration is holding talks with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. But is this a move to drive a wedge between Russia and China? We'll discuss this and more on this week's China Report. Welcome to the China Report, a news show produced in collaboration with Pivot to Peace. Every week, we'll be helping you sort through the propaganda with an independent view of the country that we're taught to hate, but know so little about. I'm Amanda Yee. These are this week's headlines. China just launched an AI model to diagnose rare genetic diseases more quickly and more accurately. According to Chinese media, this model, called PUMCH Genesis, is in its trial phase and can quickly flag possible rare genetic diseases or complex neurodevelopmental conditions while also offering medical recommendations, including further consultations and necessary exams. PUMCH Genesis was based and trained in China's accumulated rare disease knowledge and genetic data from its population. It's the world's first rare disease model tailored to Chinese demographics. It improves diagnostic accuracy and efficiency for clinicians while shortening confirmation timelines, as delayed diagnosing and misdiagnosing can be critical for patients. Chinese blockbuster Ne Zha 2 has shattered records to become the highest-grossing animated film of all time worldwide. With nearly $2 billion in sales now and the vast majority of its revenue coming from China, Ne Zha 2 has now surpassed previous record holder Inside Out 2. The film also broke a 20-year-old record by becoming the highest-grossing animated IMAX movie of all time, surpassing the previous record holder, 2004's The Polar Express. Ne Zha 2 is a sequel to 2019's Ne Zha, and the animated fantasy film is based on a 16th century Chinese novel, The Investiture of the Gods. It depicts a young boy with magical powers who tries to defend his hometown. The movie was released on January 29th, coinciding with the start of Chinese New Year. Japan and the Philippines have agreed to boost military cooperation to counter China. Speaking at a press conference on Monday, Japanese Defense Minister Gen Nakatani and Philippine Defense Secretary Gilberto Teodoro Jr. stated they had agreed to establish a strategic dialogue between their countries' militaries and a high-level framework for defense equipment and technology cooperation. Japan and the Philippines, who both have mutual defense treaties with the U.S., have been among the most vocal critics of Beijing's activities in the disputed South China Sea, which is estimated to carry about one-third of global shipping. Last Friday, China's military said it drove away 3 Philippines aircraft illegally flying over the Spratly Islands. This marked the second aerial incident last week involving Beijing and Manila in the South China Sea. 2 more survivors of the Nanjing Massacre passed away on Saturday. Yi Lanying died at the age of 99, while Tao Chengyi died at the age of 89. This follows the deaths of 2 other survivors who passed in January, as we reported a few weeks ago. Wu Xiuying at the age of 92 and Ai Yiying at 97. Yi and Tao's deaths brings the number of living registered survivors of the massacre to 28, according to China's Memorial Hall of the Victims of Nanjing Massacre. The Nanjing Massacre occurred when Japanese troops captured the then Chinese capital of Nanjing on December 13, 1937. Over the course of 6 weeks, Japanese soldiers killed 300,000 Chinese civilians and unarmed soldiers in one of the worst atrocities ever seen, leading some to call it the Forgotten Holocaust. Yesterday, February 24th, marked 3 years of war in Ukraine, and after 3 years of war, the Trump administration is holding peace talks with Russia to begin the process of ending the conflict. But some see this as Trump trying to isolate China. To discuss this, we're very happy to have on returning guest Ben Norton. Ben is an independent journalist based in China and the host of Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Yeah, so lots to talk about. First, let's start off on February 18th, Trump's Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he met with the Russian foreign minister in Riyadh, setting into motion Trump's plan of pursuing negotiations with Russia to end the war in Ukraine. And currently, Trump is planning more peace talks with Putin. So this was a key tenet of Trump's platform, ending the war in Ukraine, or at least ending U.S. involvement in the war in Ukraine. And this represents a pretty dramatic shift in U.S. foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia and Ukraine. So I guess I was hoping that you could help us clarify, what Trump is doing here, what's his plan, and what does China have to do with all of this?
Yeah, great questions. First of all, I think it's important to push back against this idea that Trump is supposedly a peace president. I mean, you have to ignore basically everything that Trump's doing to believe that. Not to mention his first term when, he killed the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, expanded the war in Yemen, did not end the war in Afghanistan, occupied Syria's oil fields, etc. Started the trade war on China that was then continued by Biden. But in terms of this administration, we've now seen that, Trump is promising to expand the U.S. empire. And he said in his inauguration speech, he's going to expand the territory of the United States. He's, of course, threatening to colonize Greenland. And he wants to get Greenland because, as Marco Rubio revealed, the U.S. wants to prevent China from getting access to the Arctic as climate change gets worse and worse, largely due to the kind of drill baby drill policies of the Trump administration. They want to prevent China from getting access to the Arctic and use Greenland as a big base. They are threatening to colonize the Panama Canal. They're threatening to invade Mexico. Elon Musk is talking about doing drone strikes in Mexico. They're threatening Canada. Trump says he wants to colonize Gaza and ethnically cleanse Palestinians. So this brings us to Ukraine. And supposedly, Trump is going to broker peace. But in reality, what he's doing is he's trying to prepare for conflict with China, for the new Cold War on China. And the Trump administration's policy was stated by Marco Rubio. They want to have more resources to prepare for China, which they see as the largest so-called threat to the U.S. empire. Marco Rubio referred to China as the greatest challenge ever to the United States. He said it's much more of a so-called threat than the Soviet Union was. He said the Soviet Union was a so-called military threat, whereas China is a so-called economic and political and technological and military threat. Of course, this is nonsense. China is not going to invade the U.S. They're not a threat to the people of the United States. They're a threat to the dominance of the U.S. empire and the U.S. ruling class that wants to control the entire global economy and prevent any competitors to Silicon Valley monopolies. But the Trump administration says that essentially Ukraine is not part of our imperial sphere of influence. This is the way they see the world, kind of like 19th century colonialists. This is why they're trying to reassert the so-called U.S. sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. They're saying, Greenland is part of our sphere of influence. Mexico is part of our sphere of influence. Ukraine is not. So Trump is essentially saying, look, we don't care about Europe. We're no longer going to try to maintain a global empire in every region of the world. Instead, we're going to focus on two regions, the Western Hemisphere, which is why they're trying to impose these kinds of neo-colonial policies in Latin America, invoking the colonial Monroe Doctrine. And then the other region is the Pacific. So those are the two emphases of the Trump administration's foreign policy: asserting U.S. hegemony in the Western Hemisphere and asserting U.S. hegemony in the Pacific region. And Marco Rubio actually, he gave an interesting speech last year in a Senate hearing in which Rubio complained that the war in Ukraine was helping China, as he put it, because the U.S. and NATO were spending so many resources fueling this war in Ukraine. And he said that we should be using those resources instead to focus on China. And now the Trump administration is trying to make a grand bargain with Russia and is trying to pressure Russia to reduce its relations with China, which I honestly do not think is going to be successful. We can talk about that. But this is the explicitly stated strategy of Donald Trump. In October, he did an interview with Tucker Carlson, and Trump said that it was a horrible mistake, and he said it was stupid that the U.S. had pushed together China and Russia. And Trump said, I'm going to unite Russia and China. He claimed that Russia and China are natural enemies and that the U.S. should exploit the historic tensions between Russia and China. Now, at this point, Russia and China actually have their closest relations in history. They've never been as close today as they are. Maybe you could say right after the victory of the revolution in China in 1949, in the early 1950s, there was a period where the Soviets and the Chinese were very close. But of course, because of the Sino-Soviet split in the 1960s, the former Soviet Union and China had very tense, very negative relations. Today, they are very close. They're very close partners.
Yes, and some people are actually calling... Some people are actually calling this Trump's reverse Kissinger strategy. Harkening back to when Kissinger met with Mao in 1972, and I think like Kissinger was actually trying to exploit the Sino-Soviet split. But yeah, if you wanted to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, that's exactly. I was just about to say that. So thanks that's a great segue. So in 1971, Richard Nixon, Nixon's national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, visited China in a secret trip. And then in 1972, Nixon went. And this was really shocking to a lot of people because, of course, Nixon was very similar to Trump in a lot of ways, a very right-wing anti-communist, vehement anti-communist. And yet he recognized that there was a possibility, a geopolitical opening, because in the 60s, the Soviet Union and China had a falling out for a variety of political reasons. And it started kind of as geopolitical differences. There were also ideological differences. And then it was related to the split in the international communist movement. And it's very complicated. But the point is that the U.S. recognized that they could exploit those differences. Today, we're in a different moment, right? Because China and Russia are very close partners. It's not like the situation in 1971 when Kissinger went, and then in 72 when Nixon went. It's a very different historical moment. And also China today is so much more powerful than the former Soviet Union was. I mean, China is the world's largest economy. It has been since 2016 when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. China is by far the leading industrial power in the world, representing about 1/3 of global manufacturing production. China is the global supply chain. You know, the U.S. is trying to do what they say, securitize their supply chain and decouple from China, but they can't do it because the entire supply chain is in China. So China and Russia have very complementary economic relations. China is the largest trade partner of Russia. The situation in the 60s and 70s between the Soviet Union and China was so different. And now, you're right, this is being referred to as a reverse Kissinger or reverse Nixon. And it's actually not new. It's very appropriate to call it a reverse Kissinger because during Trump's first campaign, his first term, he wanted to do the same thing. And the Daily Beast reported in 2018 that Kissinger had actually advised Trump that Trump should improve relations with Russia in order to try to isolate China. And it actually, ironically, probably would have been possible then, at least more possible then. You know, we're talking about, at this point, 8 years have passed since Trump first entered in 2017. The situation has changed so much. China and Russia are much closer today than they even were then, and they were already close then. So the reason that Trump in his first term was not able to pursue the strategy that Kissinger had promoted of a reverse, what was known as triangular diplomacy, of using the triangle between China, Russia, and the U.S. and dividing the other country. Well, the reason it didn't succeed the first time was ironically because of Russiagate. Remember, like this ridiculous conspiracy pushed by the Democrats that Trump is like a Putin puppet. But what they didn't see is that the reason that Trump was trying to push for closer relations with Russia is precisely because they want to weaken China and prepare for war. That's what they're preparing for, is for war on China eventually.
Yeah, you said a lot of things just now that I want to expand on. But first, I want to talk about this idea that you were talking about a few minutes ago, that pushing back on the idea that Trump is any kind of anti-war president. And I want to talk about this idea of peace through strength, which is central to the Trump administration's foreign policy. This idea that you can project into like total military domination across the world, and that will secure your own peace, secure the peace of the United States. But it's like kind of this oxymoron, right? Because you're basically, like in the case of China, what peace through strength means is strengthening the military encirclement around China, arming Taiwan, continuous militarization of the South China Sea. That's peace through strength. That's the strategy. But no country on earth would tolerate the U.S. just like building up its military around its borders the way that the U.S. is doing. And I have this clip that I want to show you. It's Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth in Brussels earlier this month, and he's talking to the representatives of NATO, and he's talking about this idea of peace through strength and how we need to, NATO needs to put in its own, the NATO countries need to fund their own defense so that the U.S. can turn to more important matters, namely the militarization of its border and pivoting to a war with China. So I want to show you this clip and get your thoughts.
Safeguarding European security must be an imperative for European members of NATO. As part of this, Europe must provide the overwhelming share of future lethal and non-lethal aid to Ukraine. Members of this contact group must meet the moment. This means donating more ammunition and equipment, leveraging comparative advantages, expanding your defense industrial base, and importantly, leveling with your citizens about the threat facing Europe. Part of this is speaking frankly with your people about how this threat can only be met by spending more on defense. 2% is not enough. President Trump has called for 5%, and I agree. Increasing your commitment to your own security is a down payment for the future, a down payment, as you said, Mr. Secretary, of peace through strength. We're also here today to directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe. The United States faces consequential threats to our homeland. We must and we are focusing on security of our own borders. We also face a peer competitor in the communist Chinese, with the capability and intent to threaten our homeland and core national interests in the Indo-Pacific. The U.S. is prioritizing deterring war with China in the Pacific, recognizing the reality of scarcity and making the resourcing trade-offs to ensure deterrence does not fail. Deterrence cannot fail for all of our sakes.
Yeah, so after the annual NATO summit in DC last year, it was required that the majority of the NATO countries spend 2% of their GDP on defense. Now Hegseth is saying 2% isn't enough. We want you to pay 5%. Why? Because we need to focus on our border. We need to focus on the growing threat of China. We can't be bothered with dealing with this war that doesn't really have anything to do with us. So your thoughts?
No, it's crazy. I mean, during Trump's first term, a lot of Trump's liberal critics said, oh, he was weakening NATO. But the irony is actually he strengthened NATO because during his first term, he kept telling all these European members of NATO, you have to increase your military spending to 2% of GDP. Now he's saying you need to more than double your military spending to 5%, which is insane. And of course, one of the reasons he wants to do that is because NATO has this concept known as interoperability, which is that every member of NATO, all of their militaries, have to have military technology that is interoperable, that can be used by the other members of different militaries, which is a fancy way of saying that it all needs to be bought from the United States. So he's saying that you need to buy more than twice as many weapons and ammunition from U.S. corporations in the military-industrial complex to benefit Northrop Grumman and Lockheed Martin and Raytheon. And a few things to talk about here. I'm glad you showed that full clip because then you can see the entire narrative of the Trump administration. It's not about peace. The narrative is that Europe needs to focus on its own security. We are not focusing on Europe. We're not prioritizing Europe. We're prioritizing war with China. That's what he said clearly there. He said, you should focus on your own security. We're going to focus on the Pacific, on the Communist Party of China. Well, they always say China's Communist Party, which is not the official name. But so a few points to respond to here. First of all, who is this guy, Pete Hegseth? People should know. He is a Fox News host, a complete neocon. There's nothing populist or anti-war about this guy, a total neocon. He wrote a book, which is insane. I was reading through it. It's called American Crusader, and he refers to himself proudly as a crusader. It's funny seeing that video because you can see he's hiding some of his tattoos. He has a bunch of crusader tattoos and white nationalist tattoos. Okay, so he's the defense secretary, the head of the Pentagon. The head of the State Department is the king of the neocons, Marco Rubio, who has loved every single U.S. war, obediently supported every single U.S. war. He does not have a single anti-war bone in his body. And then Trump's national security advisor is Mike Waltz, another Fox News regular. I mean, Trump just picked all the guys he saw on Fox News. And Mike Waltz is another insane neocon. I went through and watched some of his old Fox News interviews, and he's so crazy. He claims that China supported Mexican cartels to attack the U.S., and he claimed that China supported ISIS. These guys are insane. I mean, they are complete mouth-foaming anti-China hawks, complete neocons. And the way they see the world is that the U.S. needs to focus on its imperial spheres of influence. I know I already made this point, but I want to stress it because it's so important to understand the Trump administration's worldview. Trump, Rubio, Hegseth, Waltz, there's this narrative that they are trying to move away from war and pursue a more peaceful world. It's not true at all. It's a complete misreading of the situation. Some people took out of context comments that Marco Rubio made when he did an interview with the former Fox News host, Megyn Kelly, and he said that we're in a multipolar world. That was not the first time that he said that. Marco Rubio has said this several times. I followed Marco Rubio very closely. In 2022, he did a Senate hearing, fear-mongering about China. He said the same thing. Last year, he did a Senate hearing. He said the same thing. He said, we're in a multipolar world. But when he says that, he doesn't mean multipolar like China or many global South countries mean multipolar. When China talks about multipolarity, which Foreign Minister Wang Yi discussed in a very good speech he gave at the Munich Security Conference. He said, we don't want great power competition. He said, great power competition has been horrible for the rest of the world. He said, we need to move beyond colonialism, and he said, we need to move beyond the core periphery structure of the world. He said, for China, multipolarity means a world in which all countries, regardless of their size, are treated equally and have equal representation in international institutions. And China called for the practice of true multilateralism, the reform of global governance institutions like the United Nations, so all countries can pursue their own independent paths of development and pursue win-win cooperation. That's China's view of multipolarity, which is an anti-imperialist view, shared by many countries in the global South. When Marco Rubio talks about multipolarity, he means something very different. He means 19th century style imperialist competition with imperial spheres of influence. And essentially what the Trump administration is saying is that in the 90s and the early 2000s, there was a unipolar world, and the U.S. tried to dominate every single region of the world. This was the stated policy of the Pentagon in the Wolfowitz Doctrine, and it was also the idea of full spectrum dominance. The Wolfowitz Doctrine said that the U.S. must be the most powerful country in every major region. They named 5 regions, including the Western Hemisphere, Europe, the Middle East, West Asia, the Pacific, and they said that we need to be the most powerful country in every single region. And what the Trump administration is now saying is that we can no longer do that. Europe is not a focus of dominance. They're saying Africa as well. So there's a myth going around, which is not true, that Trump wants to cut the Pentagon budget. That's actually based on a misreading of a Washington Post report. They claim he's going to cut the Pentagon budget by 8%. That's not what he's doing. He's reducing spending in some parts of the Pentagon by 8% and then moving that 8% funding to other parts like the Pacific, like the Western Hemisphere. So he's not cutting the Pentagon budget. He's shifting money around. But then Trump supporters are saying, oh, he's cutting the war budget. He's not doing that. And what he's doing is he said he wants to cut the budget for instance, AFRICOM, African Command. The U.S. military is active in over half of the countries on the African continent. Trump is saying Africa is not our sphere of influence. We need to instead move that funding to the Pacific region to prepare for war with China. And the same thing with Europe. So again, this is a complete misreading of what's happening. The U.S. empire has recognized that it can't control the entire world, so it's making a strategic retreat from Europe and Africa and redoubling its forces in the Pacific and in the Western Hemisphere.
I'm glad you're pointing that all out, because for the last few years, there's been this split within the ruling class over which war to prioritize. You know, the proxy war with Russia via Ukraine, or, confrontation with China. So clearly the Trump administration is pivoting toward the latter. The previous Biden administration's orientation toward China was more of like managed competition or strategic competition, in which they definitely escalated the Cold War and they, provided arms to Taiwan. They increased the military encirclement of China, but there were still like a few key areas that they were willing to work with China on. But to me, and you did a really good job of explaining this, the Trump administration represents like a major qualitative shift in the U.S. orientation toward China. And so it's like ridiculous to me that he can paint himself as an anti-war or anti-imperialist president, because this represents a major acceleration of war with China, no matter what they call it, peace through strength or whatever.
Yeah, well, this is why people in Latin America and the Latin American left always have the sharpest, most critical view of imperialism, because they can see clearly that, Trump is saying I'm going to end war. But then in Mexico, people are like, he's going to invade us. How can you call him anti-war? Literally, they're preparing for an invasion of Mexico. I'm not being hyperbolic. I wish I were joking. The Trump administration is making plans to send U.S. troops into Mexico. They're already preparing for that because they listed Mexican cartels as so-called terrorist organizations, which is absurd. And as I said, on Twitter, you can find Elon Musk said that they're preparing for drone strikes in Mexico. So they're just going to do like the Bush war on terror, but instead of doing it in West Asia, North Africa, they're going to do it in Latin America, in Mexico, the U.S. southern neighbor. It's so crazy. So in terms of China, it's so important to understand that regardless of who the president is, regardless of the party, if you listen to imperial strategists in Washington, in U.S. government-funded think tanks, in the Pentagon and the CIA, they all have the same message. China is the biggest so-called threat to the United States, period. This was true even in the Biden administration. You're right that the Biden administration's approach to China was a little different. It was still very aggressive, but they called it managed competition, although it's mostly rhetorical. I mean, the Biden administration, not only did they continue Trump's tariffs on China, but they put more tariffs on China. They really hurt diplomatic relations with China. They tried to isolate China diplomatically by holding these international conferences where they, the Summit of Democracies, where they invited, Taiwan separatists and all this stuff. So, especially when it came to Taiwan, they were really supporting separatism in Taiwan, which is not popular. I mean, if you look at polls, the vast majority of people in Taiwan say that they want the status quo. They do not want independence. It's a small minority. It's like 7 or 8%, depending on what year you look. It's like less than 10% of people in Taiwan who actually want independence. But the Biden administration was strongly supporting them. And now we come with the Trump administration, and what are they doing? The Marco Rubio State Department removed language from their official position on Taiwan. They removed language saying that they do not support independence. So that's another green light to these extremist forces in Taiwan, who, if they declare independence, that's going to be a war. I mean, they're setting the stage for a war. So I'm not trying to say that, of course, Biden was less dangerous than Trump and was the lesser evil. You're right to point out that their strategies are different, but of course they were both very hawkish. What I'm emphasizing is that regardless of who the president is, everyone says that China is the greatest threat. So as an example, in the Biden administration, the CIA was led by William Burns, and they published this statement on their website in 2021, or 2020, referring to China as the greatest threat, the greatest challenge of the 21st century. And then, and they also use the term threat. And then the CIA created a China Mission Center, which is the only CIA mission center dedicated to one country. And we all know that the CIA, they organize regime change operations and coups and try to destabilize foreign governments. They're trying to destabilize China. And then Donald Trump's CIA director, John Ratcliffe, when he did his Senate hearing in January, he praised the Biden administration's CIA for its anti-China operations. And he also said that the Trump administration considers China to be the greatest so-called threat to the United States. So Everything else is honestly window dressing. It's all distraction. All of this stuff about defunding USAID, which is not true, by the way. They merged USAID into the State Department under Marco Rubio. And if you listen to the hearings that they had about USAID, they all said that the work that USAID is too important to defund because they need to fund anti-China operations. But instead, they're ending the transparency of USAID, which publishes all its stuff. They're a CIA cutout, but they publish their stuff publicly, so we know which countries they're funding these destabilization operations in, the infrastructure for a color revolution. Well, instead of having that all public, they're just going to all do it covertly through the State Department under Marco Rubio. So everything that they're doing, it's all window dressing. It's all a distraction from the real target. The real emphasis of the U.S. empire is trying to do everything they can to weaken China.
I want to get back to this idea of the reverse Kissinger strategy and whether or not Russia or the U.S. will be able to isolate China. It feels a little bit like Trump is getting kind of high on his own supply. And I want to hear your thoughts on this. But to me, it doesn't really seem likely that Russia will split from China. And you discussed it a little bit a few minutes ago. I feel like the opposite is happening, right? By the time Kissinger met with Mao in 1972, as you pointed out, the Sino-Soviet split had already happened and Kissinger was just trying to exploit it. To me, what seems likely is that Russia will seek opportunities from both sides, but for Trump to expect Russia to abandon the countries that, supported it over the last few years by allying with the country that has been sending Ukraine weapons, in exchange for a few agreements that will just be broken in a few years, that just doesn't seem likely to me. But on the part of China, Xi Jinping had a phone call with Putin yesterday in which he told him that the two countries could not be moved away from one another. So I guess it doesn't really seem likely that there's going to be a Russia-China split. What seems like it's happening now is that there's the beginning of a split between the US and the EU. So curious to know your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis 100%. We even see some politicians like the foreign minister of Spain gave a speech saying that the EU needs to have its own independent foreign policy and pursue its own relations with China. Although we shouldn't be too optimistic because in the same speech he said we can cooperate with China on some things and compete with China on other things. So they still have this idea that they're in competition with China. But it is nice to hear people in the EU finally grow a spine and say that they're going to try to be independent of the US. Even Ursula von der Leyen, who's one of the most pro-US politicians in the EU, even she made similar comments. Although, again, I'm still pretty skeptical because when Trump was president the first time, Angela Merkel, the German chancellor, and also France's President Macron made very similar comments. They said they were going to create a pan-European standing army. They created this institution called Instex to try to go around U.S. sanctions on Iran because, of course, Trump withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal and put illegal sanctions on Iran. And Europe said they're going to continue trading with Iran. And what happened? They never used this Instex institution. They created it. They never used it. And then they closed it down. So, European politicians, they love to say things, but when it actually comes to, when the rubber hits the road, when it comes to actual action, I'm still pretty skeptical. But again, what we do see is that Europe is pantomiming, saying they're going to deepen their relations with China in protest of the U.S. At the very least, that's better than them not saying that. As for this attempt by the U.S. to break off Russia, I agree with you. I don't think it's likely. I mean, I will say that in Russia, there are some conservative, very conservative pro-Western types who are always suspicious of China. And especially if some of like the right-wing, far-right parties in Europe come to power, which looks likely, unfortunately, they can say, well, we can make out some kind of big deal. And they see China, as because there are anti-communists in Russia who hated the former Soviet Union, and they see China. Obviously, China is governed by a communist party, has a socialist system. But when it comes to the main leadership, people like Putin, people like Foreign Minister Lavrov, I don't think this is going to happen. I think you're right, that Trump is completely high in his own supply. Because when Putin came to power, He actually came to power originally as an anti-communist who was trying to integrate Russia to the West. The reason that Putin has the views he does now, which are very critical of the West and very pro-China and pro-Global South, is precisely because he tried all of those policies and the West spat in his face. And every time that Russia tried to integrate into the West, they were invited to join the G7. It became the G8 briefly until they were kicked out of the G8 and became the G7 again. He wanted to integrate Russia into the West, but the United States made it clear that it would only accept Russia as part of the US-led West as a subservient vassal, like it treats Germany and France and the UK. And Russia is a major country with one of the largest economies in the world. It's a major military power. He didn't want Russia to be subservient to the United States in a US-led unipolar order. You know, Putin's a nationalist, and the Russian ruling class as well. You know, there are Russian capitalists who are very powerful. They have their own independent interests. They didn't want to subordinate all of their national interests to Washington. But we know that Washington only accepts people who are vassals. It doesn't want friends, it wants vassals. And this is why, after years of trying to integrate Russia into the West, famously in 2007, Putin gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference condemning U.S. unipolarity and saying that the U.S. is trying to create this this imperial hegemonic system, and it was surrounding Russia with military bases, continuing to expand NATO up to Russia's borders. And then after he gave that speech, the Bush administration announced that Ukraine and Georgia would become members of NATO, which set off all of the conflict we've seen ever since then. And then, of course, the Obama administration carried out a coup in Ukraine in 2014, overthrowing Ukraine's democratically elected government, installing a pro-Western regime that wanted to join NATO, that set off this war. The war didn't begin with the Russian invasion in 2022. That was an escalation of the war that started with the US-backed coup in Ukraine in 2014. So, I mean, even if you look at it from the perspective of simply individual leaders, which is a very kind of liberal way of seeing the world, it doesn't understand economic forces. But even if you look at it from that perspective, Putin, as long as he's in power, I highly doubt that he will go along with this. You also can't trust the United States. I mean, look what Trump himself is a good example. Obama negotiated the Iran nuclear deal, which became part of international law. It was signed into international law through a UN Security Council resolution. And then Trump came in and he tore it up. So why would Russia negotiate some kind of deal with Trump if the Democrats come back in 4 years and then they tear up the deal again? I mean, so you can never trust the United States. I mean, they have no medium to long-term planning. It's all short-term schizophrenic ideas. But one other point, that's a kind of liberal way of, this is like liberal IR view of seeing the world. There's also simply the actual economic relations and the interests of the Russian ruling class, the Russian capitalist class, the Russian state. Russia economically is deeply integrated, not only with China, but with Asia. This was even before the Russian invasion of Ukraine with the Western sanctions on Russia, which further integrated Russia with Asia, not only with China. So China is Russia's largest trading partner, but also Russia now is deeply integrated with India, with Turkey, with Iran, with BRICS countries. China and Russia already, for instance, have de-dollarized over 90% of their trade because of the Western sanctions. Russia and China are using their own local currencies for trade. Russia and India are using their local currencies. Russia and Iran are using their local currencies. Russia and China have both created alternative interbank messaging systems as an alternative to the US-dominated SWIFT interbank messaging system. So there's so much infrastructure that has been created. I already talked about BRICS, in which Russia plays a very important role. And also there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. So there's all this infrastructure that exists that didn't exist even 20 years ago, that is strengthening, that is growing. Asia is the fastest growing region of the world economically. What does Russia need? Russia needs a big market for its natural resources. A huge part of Russia's economy relies on exporting oil, gas, wheat, fertilizer, minerals. What is the biggest importer in the world of oil, gas, fertilizer, wheat, and minerals? It's called China. It's Russia's neighbor. What is the U.S.? The U.S. is the world's largest producer of oil. Is the U.S. going to sell more oil to Russia? Russia's the second biggest producer of oil. They don't need U.S. oil. The U.S. is deindustrialized. What are they going to offer Russia? I mean, the U.S. and Russia actually have pretty similar economies, economies based on high value-added services and export of raw materials and weapons. They both have very big military industrial complexes. So, I mean, Trump thinks that he can just force every country to go against its own interests because he can just sanction them and tariff them. Russia, newsflash, Russia's one of the most sanctioned countries on earth. The U.S. putting more tariffs and sanctions isn't going to do anything. So Trump says, okay, we're going to make some kind of deal with Russia and give Russia security guarantees. But obviously, yes, Russia would like security guarantees. That's why we've seen this war in Ukraine. But they're not going to break off their relations with China for that. That would be stupid. And then Trump says, okay, we're going to lift sanctions on Russia. But I've already pointed out that, yes, the sanctions have done damage to the Russian economy, but they've also integrated Russia even more deeply with Asia. So, okay, Russia would like to go back to selling oil and gas and wheat to Europe, but Europe might not even be part of this plan that Trump is trying to negotiate. So the U.S. might lift sanctions on Russia, but will Europe lift sanctions on Russia? And maybe a few countries in Europe will, but not all of them will. The U.K. certainly won't. So, I think this is just this deal that Trump's trying to make. He thinks he can just, blackmail Russia or pressure Russia, or who knows what he's going to offer Russia. But honestly, the U.S. doesn't have a lot that it can offer Russia, whereas China and Russia have such a deep partnership and it's such a mutually advantageous relationship that I don't think it's not plausible, at least as long as Putin is in power. There is a possibility that some crazy thing happens, Putin is pushed out of power, or who knows, or in a few years he retires and some pro-Western person comes to power. Unless there's like a massive shift in Russian leadership, I do not think this is going to happen.
Well, we'll continue following these developments. And Ben, maybe you can let people know where to find you if they want to look up your analysis.
Yeah, people can go to geopoliticaleconomy.com, and there are links to everything on there, and you can find my YouTube channel. And thank you for having me. I love the work that you do here at the China Report. I also love the work that Breakthrough does, so it's always a pleasure.
Always a pleasure having you on. All right, well, that's our show for the week. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to like, share, and subscribe, and we'll see you next week on the China Report.